and you have eyes and ears and a brain, you know quite clearly that there's liberal bias in the media, and particularly strong bias against Donald Trump. Now, there was bias against Ronald Reagan, against George Bush, but the bias against Trump is pretty incredible, and it's one of the most notable things that's happened. Trump derangement syndrome has hit the American dominant media harder than I think almost any other institution. And after the president won in 2016, there was about 20 minutes of soul searching, saying, how did we miss this? Are we out of touch with America? And after a very brief period, the press has gone by for almost uninterrupted for the last 9 years in great hostility towards Donald Trump. Now, I'll say again, as I always do when I talk about liberal media bias, all presidents should be scrutinized and covered very strenuously by a media who keeps the public interest front and center. And they should be fair, but they should be very tough. What they shouldn't be is biased. And what I've said to liberals in newsrooms in which I've worked and liberals around the country who complain, Barack Obama got such coverage, or, Donald Trump's such a liar and such a horrible person, he deserves all the tough coverage. What I say is, and I've said this since the beginning of my career, if you don't believe that the media is liberally biased, believe this. This is an incontrovertible fact. Now, so is the first part, but I say to them, if you don't believe that the media is liberally biased, believe this. Half the country believes that it is, and they believe that it's insidious, and they believe that it plays a massive role in the outcome of our elections. So you don't want to believe that it's biased, believe that half the country does. It's kind of incredible to think your job is to cover American politics and government and elections, and that you cover it with an absolute bias in favor of one side. Now, there are counterexamples. They don't confuse me, but they're often used in some cases to say, well, there's not a bias. I believe, it's hard to do this quantitatively, but I believe qualitatively that we've seen presidential elections in which the Republican got more favorable coverage. I think Donald Trump got more favorable coverage in 2016 than Hillary Clinton. I think George Bush got more favorable coverage than both Al Gore and John Kerry when he ran for president. But those are exceptions, which I can explain. I won't today, but I can explain them. The norm is to cover Republicans much harder. And that's not just at the presidential level, it's at all levels. Okay? And even now, you hear prominent members of the media say there is no liberal bias. Incredible to me. I mean, incredible. And what's so distinctive about what I'm going to talk about today is we have two guys who worked at dominant media organizations in the first tier. Glenn Kessler at the Washington Post joined just before 2000, so there for about 27 years. Terry Moran, my former ABC News colleague at ABC News for the same duration of time. And these guys have both left their news organizations. Glenn Kessler took the buyout. We'll talk to him about that, where the paper's slimming down, so offering a buyout to people who've been at the paper for a while to save money. And Terry Moran famously was forced out of ABC News. His contract was up, but not renewed, because he wrote some really negative things about Stephen Miller and the president on social media. Okay. Those two guys have broken the code a little bit. You know, the expression, someone says the quiet part out loud. These guys have said the silent part out loud. And what they've said in both cases is not remarkable in the sense that it is true, but it is remarkable in the sense that you don't normally hear people who've worked in the dominant media, the liberal media, you don't normally hear them admit it. So I want to look at a couple things that they said in their Substacks and talk about it, because I was gobsmacked by both. I couldn't believe that they were writing the truth. And this is a little complicated, but they don't seem embarrassed about the truth. And again, I'm going to ask Glenn Kessler about it. We asked Terry Moran to be on as well. He wasn't available. They don't seem to be embarrassed. They state it, but they don't say, well, this is, of course, a disaster. This is, of course, a nightmare. This is, of course, inappropriate for this to be the state of American media. They simply state it. And the other thing is, I've tweeted about these two Substacks, and it's caused a little bit of an uproar. But in a just and sensible world, these two guys and what they've said would be the topic of extraordinary debate in our political media culture. People would be talking about it. Now, again, on X, people are a bit. But what they've said is extraordinary. They've admitted something, but then said explicitly, or at least implicitly, this isn't a problem. Let me show you what I mean. So here's Glenn Kessler, again, just started a Substack, and he wrote the Substack. It's primarily about his leaving the paper. And he said before he left the Washington Post, before he took the buyout, he wanted the paper to reinstall the position of ombudsman. It's a position they had, but was eliminated for cost purposes. Ombudsman, I think, is a good thing. It's a person who works for the paper, but has absolute independence to write whatever they want. And they primarily write, maybe I'd say exclusively write, about the journalism done by that organization. To say when they get complaints from readers or sources or subjects of stories, have they done it fairly? Now, if you're in that job, like in any job in journalism, you shouldn't be biased. And I read the ombudsman for the Washington Post used to have one, the New York Times. Very few papers have them anymore. Sometimes they were not biased. So the piece is largely about his interactions with the editor of the paper, arguing that there should be an ombudsman, and then arguing that as he takes the buyout, the Post should keep the fact checker on. Now, the fact checker, conservatives would tell you, and this is what I observed, he would fact check Republicans a lot more than Democrats, and he would fact check Democrats less hard when he fact checked them than Republicans. Not without exception, and we'll talk to him about that. But Republicans would tell you, just like the CNN fact checker, occasionally will fact check a Democrat just to keep their hand in and to suggest a level of bias. But this is largely about fact checking Republicans. And famously, for instance, he fact checked the question of whether the videos showing Joe Biden's obvious cognitive mental decline, whether those were so-called deep fakes or cheap fakes. And he basically said that they were, and that Republicans were, that news organizations were taking Republican video and using it to create a misleading impression. Again, I could give you other examples, but I think that one tells you what you need to know about how conservatives viewed him. And as I said, he famously gave out Pinocchios. So if you lied a little bit, you got one Pinocchio. You lied a lot, you got two, three for, a pretty big lie. And then four was kind of the ultimate in this person's lying. And I have to say, I give him credit. He was pretty rigorous about trying to make it meaningful. But in my experience, again, slanted. All right. In that Substack that he wrote, he also wrote about the Post and the question of bias. And he said, when he met with the editor said to him, he alleges, what could we do at the paper to appeal to Fox News viewers? When Michael Jordan was playing basketball, and he was a Democrat, but he wouldn't endorse Democrats. And people asked him, why? If you're a Democrat, why wouldn't you endorse Democrats running for office? He would say, because Republicans buy sneakers too. And that was the attitude that my mentor at ABC News, Peter Jennings, had, which is we shouldn't just be trying to win liberal viewers. We should be trying to win the whole country. Why would you take basically half the market and say, we're not interested in your business? So here's what Glenn Kessler said in thinking about the business. Now, I will say this. I'm a journalist who thinks about business. I always have. I've always thought of what's our business model? How are we going to make money? And you've seen the failure, even of people in the management side of these news organizations over the years, to think about the realities of a changing marketplace has led to the precarious position a lot of these organizations find themselves in. But journalists themselves almost never think about business. But Glenn Kessler, in the context of this Substack, writes about the Post business model. Here's what he says. B1, conservatives were an untapped market for growth, especially for a news organization where traffic was falling. And I'll say parenthetically, the Post is in a world of hurt because of declining revenue and audience. He continues, but there's a conundrum. If most of your readers are liberal, how do you attract conservatives without losing your existing base? So he has various ways, he says in the column, to know that his audience, the Post readership, is liberal. So again, he raises the question, if the current readership is liberal, how are you supposed to get conservatives? He goes on. This is B2. The Washington Post readers who cared about politics and the federal government, most of them are liberal and probably never watch Fox News. Finally, Glenn Kessler, B3 here. While it would be great to get a more balanced mix of liberal and conservative readers, I didn't understand how one could attract conservative readers who have their choice of many right-wing news sites besides Fox without alienating existing readers. So again, he's absolutely right. The Post readership is liberal, and the Post business model is dependent on keeping those liberal readers. And if the Washington Post wants to be a text version of MSNBC, They can be. That'd be the choice of the ownerships. Although the current owner, Jeff Bezos doesn't seem to want to be that. He seems to want to change it. Famously dropped the practice of endorsing, so they weren't going to endorse Kamala Harris for president, has suggested the editorial page will be less hospitable to liberal voices. A bunch of liberal journalists have left the Washington Post, columnists and reporters. Some have left the Washington Post, not necessarily because they're liberal, but because the paper is a mess. But why is the paper a mess? The paper's a mess because it pretends to be an organization that covers everybody fairly, everybody equally, regardless of ideology. And what has it been? Even back to the fabled days of Ben Bradley and Woodward and Bernstein, it's been a paper whose journalists and editors are largely liberal. So again, inputs and outputs. If your editors and your journalists are largely liberal, what do you think your readers are going to be? And they reflect that bias in their stories. What do you think your readership's going to be like? It's going to be liberals. So Glenn Kessler breaks down the reality and says, yeah, our business model is we're addicted to liberals. And so how could we possibly risk appealing to conservatives? Well, the answer to me is, and we'll talk to Glenn Kessler about it, don't be a liberal paper. Don't be a conservative paper. Be a world-class paper with great reporting and scoops and writing and news you can use. And if you want to throw in cooking and Wordle type games, sure. But for him to acknowledge that the paper's readers are all liberal and therefore the only way the paper can survive is to feed them liberal stuff, I find that to be insane. And again, he just basically throws up his hand and says, that's the reality. Now, I give him credit because if you ask most people at the Washington Post, who I talk to, reporters there and editors, are you addicted to a liberal audience? They'd say, oh, no, we're not. We're fair-minded. We only write fair stories. And our audience, is varied. They have some conservative readers, of course. But what a remarkable concession. We can't be fair. He's saying, in effect, we can't be fair because if we were fair, we'd go out of business because our existing audience wouldn't like us being fair. It's not about going from being a liberal paper to being a conservative paper. It's about being fair. But again, I'll say his conclusion is not the paper should change. We shouldn't be a paper who's attracting only liberals. We need to reconsider why we're doing that and build a better, bigger, more journalistically sound organization. Imagine this question. Think about it. What if you could delay your next 2 mortgage payments? That's right. Imagine putting those 2 payments right in your pocket and finally getting a little breathing room. It is possible when you call American Financing today. If you're feeling stretched by those everyday expenses, the cost of groceries, of gas, those bills piling up on the desk, you're not alone. Most Americans are now putting these expenses on their credit cards, and that doesn't seem to leave any way out. But there is. American Financing can show you how to use your home's equity to pay off that debt. You need to call American Financing today before you get to that point where you can't make those payments. Their salary-based mortgage consultants are helping homeowners just like you restructure their loans and consolidate debt, all without any upfront fees. And their customers are saving an average of, get this, $800 a month. That's the equivalent of a $10,000 raise. It's fast, it's simple, and it could save you before your budgeting this summer becomes a total wreck. So call now before it's too late. 866-886-2026. Again, that's 866-886-2026. Or you can visit americanfinancing.net/next.